Democratic Republic of the Congo opposition leader Moise Katumbi is close to finding his name on the ballot after the UN Human Rights Committee ruled in his favor to return to his home country. Katumbi was twice barred from returning to the DRC 4 weeks ago. He attempted to travel by road through Zambia to the Kasumbalesa border post after his landing permit at Lubumbashi International Airport was denied. The decision by the Congolese authorities to block Katumbi from entering the country prevented him from filing his presidential nomination. The United Nations Committee has ruled that the popular opposition leader be allowed to return to the DRC and that authorities in that country should guarantee his security and participation in the general election. Well, to shed more light on the recent ruling in favor of Moise Katumbi, we are now joined via Skype from France in Paris by Ida Sawyer, the Deputy Africa Director at the Human Rights Watch. A very good evening to you, Ida. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, can you summarize the findings of your report regarding challenges facing the DRC electoral process?
Good evening, and thanks for having me. So we at Human Rights Watch, we put out a report last week about political repression that we documented as candidates attempted to register for presidential elections scheduled for later this year in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we documented how one of the presidential aspirants, Moïse Katumbi, was blocked from even entering the country to file his candidacy. And meanwhile, security forces in Kinshasa, the capital, as well as in Kasumbalesa border crossing and Lubumbashi in southeastern Congo, fired tear gas and live bullets at supporters of different opposition leaders, including Katumbi, as well as Jean-Pierre Bemba in Kinshasa and Felix Tshisekedi in Kinshasa. At least 2 people were killed and many others were injured by bullet as the security forces cracked down on these opposition supporters who were peacefully either protesting, calling for Katumbi to be allowed back in the country, or just to show their support for their candidates. And we at Human Rights Watch, we have called on Congolese authorities to allow all people to freely participate in the political process, for Katumbi to be allowed back into the country to participate, and for the other opposition candidates to be accepted on the candidate list and to freely participate in the process. And we've also called on authorities to end the brutal repression against opposition supporters and activists, and to allow people to peacefully protest without fear of being arrested or killed or injured. And the electoral process in Congo can't be credible if opposition candidates aren't even allowed to participate, and if opposition supporters are facing such severe repression by government forces.
Having said that, remember that last year the right to freedom of peaceful assembly was severely restricted in the DRC. What's your analysis or your observation about the role of security forces and, of course, the excessive use of force against opposition leaders and supporters?
This, unfortunately, is not new. This is something we've been documenting for the past at least 3 years in Congo, since 2015, as President Joseph Kabila has extended his hold on power beyond the end of his constitutionally mandated 2-term limit in December 2016. He has used repression and violence and corruption to delay elections and hang on to power, and to brutally crack down on peaceful protesters, activists, opposition leaders, opposition supporters. We at Human Rights Watch, we've documented nearly 300 people who've been killed by security forces during these protests across the country. Hundreds of pro-democracy and human rights activists and opposition leaders and supporters have been jailed. Many of them were held for months in illegal detention centers by the intelligence agency without access to their lawyers or their families. Others were, endured serious mistreatment while in detention, and some were put on trial on trumped-up charges. So this repression has continued for the past several years. We now have elections scheduled for the end of the year, and in a big step last month, Kabila did not submit his candidacy, as many feared he would attempt to run for an unconstitutional 3rd term. He has instead appointed someone else, Shadari Ramazani, from his coalition to be a candidate, and that's one step, but we are still very far from a credible electoral process. And if the opposition is not allowed to participate, if the repression against activists and the opposition doesn't end, if concerns about the credibility of the process and the Electoral Commission aren't addressed, then there's still a big risk of more violence and repression in the months to come.
Now, the prevention of Moise Katumbi and Jean-Pierre Bemba from participating in the presidential polls, how do you see this going forward? Could a re-entry of these two into the presidential race be perhaps construed as a restoration of the Congolese people right to the real elections or the democratic elections, as it were?
So it's not too late to change course and to try to correct the errors and ensure that the process is inclusive and credible. The final list of candidates is due to be published on September 19th by the Electoral Commission. Katumbi has submitted 2 complaints to the Conseil d'État, the country's highest courts, contesting the Migration Department's refusal to let him enter the country, as well as the Electoral Commission's refusal to allow him to file his candidacy. So if the Conseil d'État rules in his favor, he could be allowed back in the country and he could be able to file his candidacy. The preliminary list of candidates that the Electoral Commission published on August 24th rejected the candidacy of Jean-Pierre Bemba, who's one of the other leading opposition candidates, as well as several other candidates who had registered, and using reasons that many in the opposition and civil society leaders have said were politically motivated. Many of these leaders have since submitted complaints to the Constitutional Court, and the final list will then be published on September 19th. So there is a chance to reverse the decision and allow Bemba and the others back on the list and allow Katumbi to file his candidacy and get on the list as well.
There are also reports of the harassment of journalists who have been exposing the DRC government's heavy-handedness. What's your comment? What have you heard with regards to this?
Yeah, we've also documented numerous cases of harassment and detention of journalists who are documenting what's happening, especially regarding the political process and repression against the opposition and activists. During the Katumbi's attempt to enter the country, we documented at least 2 cases of journalists who were harassed and detained by police and intelligence agents while they were attempting just to cover the event along the border. And that's just a couple examples of many that we've documented across the country. And there's still, they're incredibly courageous Congolese journalists and activists who keep trying to do their work, to document what's happening, activists who are denouncing the violence and the repression, but it's in an increasingly difficult environment with this government crackdown.
Calls have been made for the release of political prisoners. Just how critical is this, especially ahead of the December elections? And would their exclusion have much of an impact on the actual elections?
It's absolutely critical for the political prisoners who are still in detention and the pro-democracy activists in detention to be released. This process cannot be credible when some leading political leaders are still in prison. Some of them have been detained for years. And pro-democracy activists like the Filimbi activist from the youth movement, they've been detained since late December. Carbon Benny and his colleagues, just for calling for the Constitution to be respected, calling for elections to happen. And the environment is not conducive for a credible process when these people are still in jail and others risk being arrested. So it's critical for these people to be released. This is also something that was clearly called for in the Catholic Church mediated New Year's Eve agreement, which was signed in December 2016 and set the path for a credible process. And there were a number of confidence-building measures which all sides agreed upon, which needed to happen in order to ensure the credibility of the process. And these measures largely still have not been implemented. And part of that is release of these prisoners. So that definitely needs to happen.
I mean, the current era has witnessed the increasing need by the African unions and the sub-regions, particularly the SADC region, which has been heavily criticized for not doing enough, especially in the DRC. So what do you think is the role of African and the foreign governments in ensuring that the DRC government adheres to its commitment to ensure free, fair and credible elections?
So regional leaders, including South Africa and the SADC region and the African Union more broadly, have a critical role to play to help ensure that this electoral process is credible and inclusive, free and fair, and to help prevent an increase in regional violence and instability if these elections don't go forward in a peaceful and credible manner. And we have seen some SADC officials and leaders of the region taking a stronger stance in recent weeks and months, calling for the elections to be inclusive and credible and the confidence-building measures of the New Year's Eve agreement to be implemented. And that's very encouraging. And I think we've seen the fact that Kabila did not submit his candidacy and attempt to run for an unconstitutional third term was in part an impact, a response to this regional pressure. So that shows that they can make a difference, but we can't stop here. We need that pressure to continue to increase to ensure that the outstanding elements are now implemented and that steps are taken to ensure that this process is indeed credible, inclusive, free and fair, and that all candidates are able to participate, the prisoners are released, there's confidence in the Electoral Commission, and there's an end to the crackdown on the political opposition supporters and activists in Congo.
And we certainly hope that the Congolese people are the real victors in this election. Ida Sawyer, thank you so much for joining us. That was Ida Sawyer, the Deputy Africa Director at Human Rights Watch, joining us via Skype.